Uh, yeah. How many of you seen any of the royal family of England over the weekend? None. Okay, so if none of you have seen this, why don't one of you look for shut the phone off. No, I guess it's got to be Wenmeo. So let's just mention that as an example. What I'm looking for here. Let me introduce it briefly. Geertz and Levi-Strauss and Mary Douglas all said the isolated tribe is no longer. We must do something new and different. How can we join the science of society, of anthropology, or of sociology with both the native village traditions and the modern contemporary world? So Geertz really started with the nation. And so he looked for ways that the nation could be joined with through concepts like legitimacy, Weber's ideas, with average citizens. How could citizens be linked to the nation in ways that they wouldn't just be Hobbesian, killing each other, or committing incest and being forced to kill all their children because Wotan in Wagner's work, and well, Wagner did not write that. This was an ancient German myth that was refined in Scandinavia and so forth. So it came from hundreds and hundreds of years, like the Homerian myths. So these themes were not. So that's why I'm invoking Disney, the Grimm brothers. If we take the royal family. Geertz was a specialist of Muslim religion in two countries, Morocco and Indonesia. He spent his whole career studying them. So if we start in a sense with that, as I point out, yeah, okay. We can talk about three aspects of Geertz's work. Let's just introduce that first. Harvard, Parsons, field work in Indonesia and Morocco, reading of the classics from British ethnography, which were the world leaders at the time. He then went off and did field work in both Morocco and Indonesia, and wrote several books. But he did this simultaneously. Okay, I won't go into more detail. I'll just say that. Second, middle of his career, he said, this was now the late 60s in America and in Western Europe. This was 68. This was student revolts. This was the counterculture. This was the Vietnam War. And for anthropology, simultaneously, the whole tradition of fieldwork, ethnography, and the basic categories of doing anthropological work and bringing the insights from the natives. The requirement of being an anthropologist was basically going to a village where you have to walk around barefoot and then write about it. That was all lost. What can anthropologists do and still be meaningful? What should they do? So a few of them have done things like study a neighborhood like Bronzeville in Chicago or Chinatown. Some of them have done that. But many of them, you can do two or three things as an anthropologist. Many of them have sort of gone into epistemology, critiquing what is being done, criticizing. And this was created or given a name by Adorno in Frankfurt, which we'll get to in another week or so. It's called critical sociology or critical theory. Sorry, not sociology. Critical theory, which could be musical or political or ideological or age or whatever else, but being critical, because the battle, the Marxist revolution has been lost. It's a tragedy. Adorno was implicitly saying, we've lost the battle. We're not having a revolution. There is no socialism in America. It doesn't work. So what can we do? We can criticize. That's the ideological, epistemological background of critical theory. That then joined with people in Paris like Foucault, Bourdieu, Baudrillard, who created postmodernism, which was in a sense saying, the stronger versions, as in Baudrillard, would say, there's no such thing as rationality. Rationality was an 18th century French metaphor in the Encyclopedia and the French Revolution, but we're too subtle. We know there's no such thing. There's tragedy. People have their personal indulgences, but there's no real science. There's no way to overcome what's in one person's head. Okay, so that strong version in different forms has penetrated some of the social and cultural criticism, especially within anthropology, parts of sociology, parts of literary, especially some of the literary critics say. And I mean, when Baudrillard was, these people were also reacting, let me add that, these people were reacting against Levi-Strauss. They saw Levi-Strauss as continuing the science paradigm from 18th century France, or back to Newton, back to the Greeks, and they were against it. What to do? So Goetz is what, I don't know, 20 years, whatever, younger than 30 years younger than Levi-Strauss. Goetz was in the middle of his career when these kinds of debates were going on in Frankfurt, in Paris. 20 years later, they came to England, and they in the US, they were back and forth. They were in literature department. So the second phase of Goetz's career, he did mostly epistemological criticism and attacked Levi-Strauss as the icon of scientific anthropology and science. So it's a nasty, beautifully written, lovely, elegant sentences, but he calls Levi-Strauss King Reason, capital K, capital R, and things like that. It's a story, and it's a review in Encounter magazine if you want to look it up, and it's in the essays of. Okay, so phase one, Harvard Parsons fieldwork. Phase two, epistemological challenge. Phase three, at the very end of his life, he wrote he gave videos, and he gave lectures at Harvard that are published by Harvard University Press on his own career and the framework of anthropology as a cultural science. And I shouldn't say a cultural science. He was against science, basically, at that phase. And he in the first pages of this work, he invokes Fabrice's, I'm almost quoting from him, Fabrice's role at the Battle of Waterloo as a metaphor for his own professional failure. So that's almost Goetz's sentence. Let me ask if any of you playing literature now, not science, playing literary reader, anybody knows what he's talking about? I bet nobody does. Who's Fabrice? What was the Battle of Waterloo? And what did Fabrice do in that battle? Anybody answer any of those? This is on page 2, telling you about Goetz's biography. It says, this is my career. Okay, the Battle of Waterloo was, anybody guess on that? This was the most critical battle between Napoleon and the English, the British. And it was, I think it was in Belgium or around there. But But basically, Napoleon, like Hitler, had conquered all of Europe. He brought reason from 1789, from the encyclopedias. He brought the metric system. He brought straight lines where they built roads as straight lines. The French ideals of rationality and structural Cartesianism were front and center. And Hegel loved it. Hegel wrote about, this is bringing a rationality to this feudal society of Germany. Beethoven said, yes, the emperor, etc. He went on, Eastern Europe. And again, like he went beyond Hitler, he went beyond St. Petersburg, he went to Moscow. In Moscow, they practically burned the entire city, so that when the Napoleonic troops arrived in Moscow, they practically starved. I mean, it was freezing winter and there was no food. Okay, so you could say that was one of the critical battles of integrating all of Europe. But they retreated, they went back, and one of the people on horseback at the gates of Moscow was named Stendhal. Who is Stendhal? General culture question. You should all know who Stendhal is. Three of the biggest names of 19th century European Romanticism, or 19th century, are Rossini, Wagner, and Stendhal in Italy, Germany, and France. Okay, Stendhal in France was both a novelist. He loved music. He was a general intellectual as well. He's a major cultural symbol. And there's a brilliant book. One of his brilliant books was called The Life of Rossini. So he turned to Rossini and wrote about Rossini. At the same time, Stendhal loved Italy. He went south to Italy and he wrote a lot of sort of descriptive things. Then he wrote a couple of novels where the heroes are Italians, and one of them was named Fabbrice. Okay, Fabbrice, in the novel, unnamed by Goetz, was at the Battle of Waterloo when the Napoleonic troops are coming back from Russia, and they're about to fight this time the British. So the British are fresh troops. They haven't been in Russia. They're ready to go. And so they defeated Napoleon. And if you go, I think it's Trafalgar Square is the main big square of downtown London. There's a Trafalgar standing up there. Okay, so what did Fabbrice, this is the story, this is the metaphor for Goetz's career. What did Fabbrice do in the Battle of Waterloo? He was always sort of mucking things up, but having fun at it. So he jumped on his horse. He mounted his horse backwards by mistake. So he slapped the butt of his horse and said, let's go to the battle, let's go. And both he and the horse were unsure which direction the battle was. So seated the wrong way, pummeling the horse, they sail away far from the battle, and he lived happily ever after. Okay, that's the metaphor for Goetz's career. Self-chosen. Okay, so when I saw that, I said, how many students will recognize what this is all about? And how many professors of English literature even, okay. So anyway, so my point here is that Goetz was reflecting through that metaphor on how could I have done my career differently? Because my career consisted of moving away from the tribe to the nation and then trying to understand how the nation was built when Napoleon and the British were fighting back and forth about nationalism and internationalism in military battle. All right, the metaphor, and then he's written about this more explicitly in other chapters. The biggest single event in his lifetime, Goetz's lifetime in Indonesia, was that suddenly, in the middle of him being there, studying it for his whole career, I think something over 1 million or a couple of million of Indonesians killed each other. Villages, capital city, all over Indonesia. It was mass terrorism, mass massacre. And they'd already built in advance, it was communists versus the government. Each of them were ready, and they had dug burial places for their opponents. And thousands died. They put their dead into those tombs, and then they went on. And then the next week or a couple of weeks later, they never talked about it. Okay, so Geertz says, this major event in this country that I've been studying my whole career, I can't explain it, I don't understand it, and I don't know why it happened. Therefore, I am a failure as an anthropologist. Okay, so that's how battle, rationality, so forth. He then adds slightly, maybe I needed to do some kind of comparative study of contrasting, but that would involve numbers and stuff which I don't do. So he's speaking as a BA student from an English department. And he had been in those, yeah, I have to add one more bit from his career. This is pretty fair. The last part of his career, he was professor at Berkeley, then at Chicago, and he gave his most famous paper right here called The Cockfight. When he gave it to a faculty seminar, we went to lunch together afterward. And as he was eating his hamburger, I said, you know, there's just one problem with your paper. There's no clear theory or implication of what it's saying and why, or how it connects to Max Weber or to legitimacy or to the national state or anything. You're a student of Parsons. How does this work? And what did he do? He kept eating his hamburger. Okay, so he never answered, but but he answered 30 years later, whatever, in his biography that he got on the horse backwards. Okay, why did he frame it so dramatically? What had he been doing from Chicago to 30 years later? He had been the director of the social science division of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Who knows why it's famous before Geertz? Our science, where's our science? Yiling, don't you know the Institute? Why is the Institute for Advanced Study famous for scientists and mathematicians?
I guess it's because the scientists have the identity on a topic, and that topic is also very important among his or her field. So a scientist can be famous for that things.
But do you know historically any of the people who were there and why and how they were important in the? We're dealing with world.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Okay, the one most famous name was Einstein. Einstein was in Berlin as a student in World War I, and he was horrified to see the German chemists cooking up these fancy chemical weapons that the Germans used in World War I, and they killed the British and thousands of British and French using chemical weapons before they were outlawed. So Einstein thought this was immoral, and he was very angry with the German scientists who collaborated with the government. Okay, I won't try to give you the history of Einstein, but basically around the late 1930s, Hitler was coming. He went to Princeton, and he was the key leading big name. And then there were two people named von Neumann and Morgenstern. They created something called game theory, and they did a lot of mathematical economics and modeling. Von Neumann started working with Fermi, who was here. He left Mussolini's Italy, came to Chicago, and Fermi and the others were also working on nuclear energy. And so Einstein knew about this, and Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, and said, these people can build an atomic bomb or something like that. You should back them. This is critically important for military purposes. And Roosevelt said yes. And so they gave him a lot of money, and they started working in Nevada and testing things. And the physicists were then all fighting with each other. And one quote is that Fermi said to von Neumann, you think 20 times faster than I do. That is, they have that kind of sense of competition, but also brilliance. And they work together in ways that then after the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the physicists of the world had a huge, I mean, it's like it's the American version of the Holocaust. I mean, we have done a terrible thing. We've killed people. We've gotten these chemical particles into the air. We've started a potential atomic age. So there was something called, again, published here, called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, where you had a lot of physicists arguing, talking about this, holding hearings, simultaneously working with nuclear energy on atomic energy as well as atomic bombs, but all of this going on simultaneously. Okay, so von Neumann and Einstein and others were there with Gertz. Gertz they created a section for social science after the war, and Gertz directed it. Okay, so Gertz is, in a sense, fighting with these brilliant scientists and mathematicians. And so he sees Levi-Strauss as part of that. And he sees the development of cybernetics, of the feedback mechanisms, of evolutionary models that Parsons used and we talked about. And Parsons, as well as Levi-Strauss, embraced science. They wanted to build an integrated science that went all the way from anthropology to sociology to economics to physics to mathematics, in ways that Gertz said, I want the opposite. So Gertz was closer to and so Gertz in that sense became more exacerbated, I would say, in his anti-scientific position because of being at Princeton and fighting these battles with these globally critical physicists and mathematicians. Okay, so if that's the background, what did he do? So what should we read? And I spent more time trying to figure this out for this course than I did in any other single author, because Gertz is brilliant. I knew that. But how did he make these mistakes? And how could such a smart mind say and do such Fabrice-like things and say this in his own autobiography? It's a dramatic tragedy, his self-defined tragedy of his own life and career. So I was looking for positive things, and I told you, I guess last week you said, what should we read? You don't have anything chosen. So I found something and I sent it out to you. Anybody look at it? On Java and the national funerals, weddings, and other ceremonies that they did in Java. Anybody look at it? No. Okay, you're not doing your homework. All right, it's there. But so what did he do? What did he do? He tried to say, how does a nation in Java or in Morocco or in England, where we have a long historic royal family, how do they legitimate themselves? And how does a nation get built when at the beginning you have warring tribes, whether it's in Afghanistan or communists and anti-communists in Indonesia, or Democrats and Republicans in Washington in January 2021. So Gertz's answer is to look for some specific, that is, so what I'm pointing to are Gertz wrote some very quasi-descriptive things like his cockfight paper, which, you know, he just chewed and he just munched his hamburger and didn't answer because he couldn't, but it's still considered by some his most famous paper. So that's one kind of Gertz. Another kind of Gertz is the Fabrici on the horse at Waterloo. The third kind of Gertz, I would say, I'm trying to say, why should we read Gertz today in this course? How can he help you doing your MAs? And what he did was build specific concepts and examples and gave you wonderful, rich description of how certain kinds of dynamics work. And one thing was, how do you build connections between the king, the queen, the royal court on the one hand, and the citizens of a big country like Morocco or Indonesia on the other? And so he looked back, and what he portrayed was their versions of what you've seen this weekend with the funeral of Philip, or with the what is it, a soap opera like series on Elizabeth II, whose husband has just died. This is the drama of European and English history from the Nazis. So at the beginning of that thing on Elizabeth, now there's a shot of her, the present Queen of England, and her sister in the 1930s were giving a Hitlerian salute, making fun and teasing their support for a leader. Okay, where and how do these things interpenetrate? One of Gertz's answers in a specific term, was a concept he didn't invent, is called the royal progress. And a royal progress of Queen Elizabeth I was a 1 mile long train of some 300 people with their horses, their servants, their cooks, their jesters, and the Queen herself. And they had the right to stay and spend a night or two in the home of any aristocrat in the British Kingdom. So they would often say, just a few days in advance, you know, the Queen is going to be nearby you. Could she spend Thursday night with you? And some of the aristocrats, oh my God, you know, that's next week. There are 1,000 horses that need to be fed. There are 300 people who need beds. I don't have 300 beds in my, even it's a castle, but it's not big enough for 300 people. So all of this, nevertheless, the critical point is Elizabeth I created, in a sense, the populist, noble queen who was citizen responsive. She said in a famous speech near the end of her life, "If I have honored the crown, it is because I love the people." She never married. She flirted with a number of men, but she used flirtation. She used the arts. She supported Shakespeare and brought his work to the court, as well as popular, and so people write about it as popular culture of the day with Shakespeare, as well as Walter Raleigh and others were out conquering, the seas under Queen Elizabeth. So my quick point is political populism, building those linkages she did highly successfully. And she continually was traveling around in the summer all over the British Kingdom. She was doing royal progresses. And so Gertz writes about this in Java and in Morocco as a mechanism, a cultural kind of mechanism whereby the values of the nation, nationalism, meaning of the legitimacy of this particular branch, because not only was Queen Elizabeth a cultural hero, she was also very tough, very politically sophisticated. There were people who tried to murder her all the time, and she had her own sister, Mary, Queen of Scots, killed. because she was a potential successor of the English throne. So there was tough stuff going on at the same time that there was celebration and court life, but instead of keeping it hidden in London, it was spread around with the people. And so in that sense, I'll just flash forward and say that in the book, this famous book by Barrington Moore called The Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, and he compares English, French, Germans, Russians, and Chinese. And why? So the background question, background question is, where was their democracy and why or why not? The author, Barrington Moore, was a Marxist. He hated the English, but he recognized they had the most democracy. He then has a section at the end, as a long appendix. Look at the appendix. And it's filled with 19th century, 18th, 19th century British novels. And they're all about people who live in London and who are successful in business and the stock market and investment and shipping. And then on the weekend, they go down to the manor house, and Sherlock Holmes is with us. And so then they try to solve the mystery of who killed whom. And so Sherlock Holmes wrote about these kinds of manor house mysteries and cultural activities, or charades, which they would play with the kids. And the point of this is that there was not an isolated elite, as in Moscow or Beijing or many other elites, which in other chapters he details. As you get further east to China and Russia, you get a more isolated, with the czars, with the Chinese, and so you had bloody revolutions with Mao and with Lenin to take power, because they did not take power the way Marx said should happen, that should be the economic advancement driving the political process. They took it long before Marx said it should happen. And so Lenin rewrote Marx and said, you've got to have a vanguard party and you got to be prepared to kill. And so basically that's what happened in China. And so what he details these through comparisons. And so Germany and France are intermediary cases. With the East Prussia in the basically part of Russia as the most authoritarian hierarchical branch of the German subculture. So the big question is, which I'm coming back to you for, is how to take the bits of ethnography that you get, in which Levi-Strauss uses as he did. What is there like that in Goetz? And my answer is, look at mechanisms for building nationalism and legitimacy that can come together, as in the Java, and as illustrated. We don't, or no, we go to 620. If none of you saw any of that with Prince, or have any of you seen any of this series that they're doing on the contemporary Queen Elizabeth? It's a very popular, it's a elevated soap opera in a sense. It has a week and then a week and then a week and a week. So they're in the middle of it now, still going on. But they do it and they elaborate it more. That is, it's partially made up. But they have Queen Elizabeth and what she says to Margaret Thatcher when Margaret Thatcher was queen, was prime minister. So that kind of tough battle, that was one of the toughest battles politically that Elizabeth had. She wasn't just a figurehead, and so forth. So and all these debates, and then if you will, of course, who knows about the interview of the young royal couple with Oprah Winfrey about a month ago? Someone just said many of you are not shaking your head. Teo, you want to just say 2 sentences on that?
I didn't watch the whole thing. I just know from news headlines here and there, but essentially the gist of it being that whichever prince her husband is, he's decided to split from the royal family, I think, and essentially talking about the state of relationships within the palace and how Meghan Markle was mistreated and how the Queen has a big hand in in all of this. So perhaps Princess Diana 2.0.
What are the diversity labels of Meghan Markle? Why is she so controversial that they wanted to go on Oprah's show and talk about it?
Oh, because she's African American?
She's African American, or she's American and
Mhm.
African American. So she's not British, she's not Caucasian. She went to Northwestern College, University. She's very articulate. She's an actress, and she wants to talk about it. And so they have a scandal, enough of a scandal that they're saying, we're leaving England. The royal family is mistreating us. So we're leaving England. We're not going to be king or whatever. We're going to America where we can. Okay. So this is pretty directly linked to the debates today about diversity and feminism that you're writing MAs on. Anybody want to comment or on her or that? Who especially, I'm looking at G.A. Chen, or who else was, someone else who's not here today was working on feminism too. Okay, and anyway, they said some things that were considered highly scandalous on Oprah's show, and that's now being followed up and broadcast and et cetera. So this, I'm making the simple point that these kinds of, the royal progress has gone all the way to marrying an American, although Church, I guess it was Churchill's mother was American. So it's not unique in English history, but to marry an African American is a little bit of a change for the royal family. And so the tabloids in London say some people in the royal family are criticizing Meghan Markle and that she is being treated in racist manner. Okay, so I don't know the subtleties of all of this, except to say that this is a direct linkage with what we're hearing around at least Europe and the US about diversity. Okay, so let's push on to some of the mechanisms. So the royal progress, somebody, let's maybe take, I mean, is all of this totally abstract and you've never seen any of this? That is, some of you from China, I can imagine maybe this is just Greek and you've never liked Greek and you've never seen any of this. I was going to say, maybe Wenmao, what if you look for just a little bit of say the Prince Philip funeral recently this weekend, and or if you see something, there's a great link, which maybe I didn't send it. I can't remember if I sent it out or not, that I found on Queen Elizabeth I, which just discussed her. I didn't say this before. When she was coronated and she crowned, she already was known as being close to the people. And so when she walked in a rug in going to the castle, okay, this is good stuff. Okay, here we go. Yeah, this, I think, okay, I sent this out to you, I guess. Okay, great. Let's just read a line or two here. Once you, Teo, why don't you read this? Elizabeth, just read what's in black so I can finish a bite here. No, stay up at the top first here.
Oh, that little blurb? Okay,
Yeah.
Elizabeth first. Sorry?
Can you just read what's in black in the beginning of the first paragraph in white that's below that?
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth I is considered one of the country's most successful and popular monarchs. Clever, enigmatic, and flirtatious, she rewrote the rules of being queen. But what was Elizabeth really like? And was her success down to her own skill and judgment, or an intuitive grasp of public relations?
Yeah, go ahead. The reign of Elizabeth I.
Okay. The reign of Elizabeth I is often thought of as the Golden Age. It was a time of extravagance and luxury in which a flourishing popular culture was expressed through writers such as Shakespeare and explorers like Drake and Raleigh sought to expand England's territory overseas. This sense of well-being was embodied by Queen Elizabeth, who liked to wear sumptuous costumes and jewelry and be entertained in style at her court. But life in Tudor England did not always reflect such splendor. The 16th century was also a time when the poor became poorer, books and opinions were censored, and plots to overthrow the queen were rife. Elizabeth's ministers had to employ spies and even use torture to gain information about threats to her life.
Okay. So, I mean, that's the background. And scroll down to the end, and just the last, I think it's the last 5 lines of the whole thing is good. Yeah, right there. Her greatest achievement. Last paragraph. You
Shall I
can
read?
Yeah, please.
Elizabeth's greatest achievement lay in the relationship she had forged with her people. She was ahead of her time in her grasp of public relations, and her popularity had remained undimmed. This I account the glory of my crown, that I have reigned with your loves, she said in her golden speech of 1601. Elizabeth was rewarded with loyalty and, enhanced by the glow of nostalgia, her own unique place in history.
Okay, so Queen Elizabeth II was, Queen now, was named after her, obviously. But both of them, I would say, are masterful in doing what's described here and promoting and using popular culture, including humor, including scandals, even within the royal family and so forth, but also obviously Shakespeare. Wagner, European great intellectuals of all sorts have studied Shakespeare. There's nobody as strong. I mean, even Goethe and Dante in Italy and Germany are not as strong as Shakespeare, and they're studied. I mean, if you're educated, you should be reading all of these, but you'll get a sense of the Wagner drew heavily on Shakespeare and the combinations of themes and tragedies and complex emotional reactions which are generated by actions, characters, and events which transform the meaning, and as well as mingling in comedy and other kinds of things. And then you get to, well, okay, I'll stop there. Okay, so if this is the history, do we have anything on, say, on the funeral this weekend? Or maybe you can look for that while we talk more generally, which is, I mean, we're now at the end. We got 20 minutes, 20 or less than 15 minutes. How else can we relate this to you? What of these themes can we use which will help you with either your general thinkings and readings about culture more generally, or writing an MA thesis? But all of you, even if you're getting an education in cultural analysis, even if you don't use it in your MA. So Wenbin is explicitly doing this and really reading broadly and thinking broadly. Wenbin, do you have anything to add or ask about what we've said today and how this is similar but different from the earlier sections we've read?
I guess the emphasis on the emotions is something new, and
Good. Yes.
I actually have a question for the emphasis on the connection with the people on Queen Elizabeth I. It might be very basic, but I'm just thinking about how the history of monarch, the people is always the subject of the monarch. And we sort of emphasize that Queen Elizabeth I kind of emphasize the connection with the people. I'm just wondering what's the difference between this connection with the people from the previous kind of the relationship between Queen and the people as a subject. And we talk about Wagner and all of the emotions, the feelings, and I'm just wondering if it's the decisive differences between these two kind of relationships.
The two kinds of relationships are what and what?
I think previously the monarch is also connected to people because people are the subjects of the monarchs. But then I think you kind of emphasize Queen Elizabeth I as a different kind of monarch because he's her connection with the people.
Yes. Well, the contemporary, very contemporary word is populism. Populism, in a sense, is political, stronger and stronger egalitarianism, which goes back to the Bible, goes back to the ancient Greeks, but it's gotten stronger and stronger. But it was then in the work of Wagner. He wrote these 5 volumes of how to make this emotionally powerful. That is, he didn't want to be in one village in southern Germany. He wanted to have a worldwide audience, and he did. Even if it got destroyed more than once, he destroyed the classical musical symphony and chamber music and so forth. And he did it by destroying the idea of structure and music and musicology, and said the feelings are the drivers instead. That's feeling of love. And then the challenge of love being said, morality, you've got to obey you've got to follow your wife's fidelity. And if your wife says you have wronged her because you made love with those earthlings, you must follow. And then he does what is, so morality in that sense triumphs. But the general issue of how do the people join with this? So Wagner then stressed building on folk stories and examples of how this was reinforced by folk stories that the Germans and Italians and French people knew. Cinderella, the bad sisters, the good sister, the king who comes, or whatever it is, the prince comes out of nowhere and carries off Cinderella and she lives happily ever after. I mean, that kind of folk story gets picked up and embellished. And the question then, which Queen Elizabeth had was, in which I would say every especially populist politician, as well as people who want to sell, Kellogg's cornflakes is how to have more customers, how to have more people say, yes, I respect you, you're doing a good job, versus not. And in that sense, Wagner, Stendhal, Nietzsche all wrote books about, and then of course, Freud, how to rationally analyze, and Freud's the most dramatic example, such an sensitive, intimate topic as intimacy in a way that can also become part of science. So you can join the so-called irrational, or I'd say irrational is a loose, bad label. Better label is something to do with emotion and passion and feeling, but how can that be explicitly joined with and contrasted various social arrangements? This is what Levi-Strauss did in his multiple combinations of different kinds of myths. So what then, I was going to just add one or two comparative things to join us several years from China. So looking at China in comparative perspective is what I want to get at here. And where and how have different Chinese leaders and followers successfully or less successfully mobilized support. This is called cultural policy in China today. The 5-year plan is part of that. I mean, our scenes concept in the book, I guess I mentioned, was adopted 2 months ago in the Chinese 5-year plan. So, I mean, I feel closer to this now as I see this happening. It can happen. Okay, so that is, the people writing the Chinese 5-year plan are looking for good ideas, new things. They're building cities of 2-3 million, just like that, in ways that is making the West look ancient by comparison. So how can we connect China with its multiple complicated themes? We can't obviously do all of them, but if we follow Levi-Strauss, we can look not for one definition of Chinese nationalism, but how about 50 or 100, Wen Mao? I bet you could write down easily 50 or 100 national identifying components of Chinese culture and history. And if you don't do a whole chapter, you could at least say, you know, what are 3 or 4 major components that past authors have written about, like Lucian Pye at MIT and the other guy at Harvard. I mean, these people spent their lives trying to say, what is Chinese nationalism? You ought to build on their shoulders, not just ignore them. Okay, so for all the rest of you, I'm giving you Barrington Moore as an example. The Chinese did not have the German Social Democratic Party. They didn't have the advanced economy of the Germans and the Americans in 1900. They had Lenin. So Lenin went ahead as he did. But how then did Lenin, and following him, Stalin, build relationships between the people and the leadership? This is where you get to the Eisenstein films. You get to, so what have been classically done by all the leaders in Red Square in Moscow? They have military parades. What do they do in Saudi Arabia today? They have huge, dramatic military parades. So, I mean, so that's the thing which we see everywhere. What do they do in Chicago neighborhoods? We have a Bud Billiken parade in Bronzeville. The Irish have an Irish parade. They dye the Chicago River green. These kinds of celebrations of partially ethnic, partially local identity connect with either a local ethnic group in my Chicago examples, or the nation for Stalin and Putin and others in China today, or Turkey today, or Trump versus Biden, who have alternative ways of doing this today, including the role of the Proud Boys. So if you look at, I mean, how can different, I mean, what, in a sense, if you're Trump, and I mean, I'd say, I don't want to endorse any of this at all, obviously, but Trump succeeded in beating all those other Republican candidates 5 years ago. He won the primary. Nobody thought he was ever going to do that. He came out of nowhere. That is, I won't say nowhere, but nowhere politically. That's what he says, sorry. He actually ran for president twice before, but he did nothing. But he beat the strongest candidates that people could come up with for the whole Republican Party and won. I mean, that was phenomenal. To most observers, nobody expected that to happen. And then he beat Hillary Clinton, which nobody expected to happen, including himself. Okay, so how can you, if you're trying to think this through, and if you're playing with, say, if you're Stendhal or you're Wagner, or you're a Trump advisor, I told you I used in my classes for 4 years. I used Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Black Lives Matter, and ISIS. And we said, these are 4 different cultural lenses. How do they each connect with what we're reading today? And that's what I'm asking you to try to be able to do. To take things like these ideas and say, how would they be differentially used by the Chinese and Chinese nationalism, by the Russians, by the French, by the New Englanders, by the Trump supporters, and by the different social groups backing Trump that are fighting with each other, as well as, of course, all the members of Congress and the Senate, not to mention the talk shows who build on, and I'm using, so let me add one more quick point. Maybe Queen Elizabeth succeeded brilliantly, and maybe there are lessons there which Stalin was trying to use, and which Disney, Donald Trump, ISIS were all variously using. That is, and what are some examples that so if we get some general dimensions like middle-class morality, or family strength, or individualism, or classic macho strength, how do these vary between the Proud Boys and the 20 other groups that were at different meetings? And why is this important? Not just for Trump, because we have a book we're working on called Latin Scenes, of how these things were developed in Latin Europe, where you had the Roman law tradition, but you had people outdoors in streets demonstrating from the Roman era on up to present in ways that you don't get in Northern Europe. And so we'll read Habermas about, so I don't want to wander on too much, but I'm simply saying the big takeaway from Levi-Strauss and then with Goetz in contrast is how do these many, many subtle, complicated elements of culture, called the myth 29 or myth 238, how do they combine and how do they shift, and why do they shift in ways that can build or undermine legitimacy if you do them the wrong way? And they're probably, okay, so Wenbin, I'm trying not to talk so much myself, but I'm trying to give you examples of how that you can ideally build on these things in the way you think about culture in a very general sense, not just music narrowly, not just, or sorry, well, let me add one more valuable thing that Goetz added to the study of culture. He defined culture as including those literary, musical, and textual elements like poems, like novels, those templates of culture that are not just abstractions like values, norms, and roles, but he included the actual examples like Shakespeare or the legitimacy of the Queen in doing a royal progress. So in that sense, his English literary BA background sort of was saying the text matters in defining culture and in thinking about it. And that was, I would say, was a valuable specific addition. So you can see that in some of the things that I'm talking about here. In the case, for example, of Sherlock Holmes as codifying the specifics of manor life in England and how that in turn built, this is the big theme of the book by Barrington Moore, which is followed by Lipset and followed by others. England had more legitimacy with its elite. How did it build it and maintain that through revolutions, through wars with Napoleon, with Hitler, etc., in ways that did not succeed in Germany, Russia, China, Iran, Iraq, and so forth? I mean, so those big questions, and so there's a literature outside say he's one, but just let me give you one more example. That there's a book on the degree called, I think it's called The Tory Working Class, or the Tory Working Class Voters. And it shows that the blue collar farmers and industrial workers in England, especially the rural small town people, vote for conservative parties at a higher rate than anybody in continental Europe. What that says is that many of the people who worked as maids, who worked as farmers, who worked, they don't call them peasants in England the way they do in Germany or France, but who people worked as local villagers who became friends, who went on hunting trips together, who saw generation after generation the people in the manor house give them food if they're hungry, take care of their children if they're sick, pay for going to a hospital before there was a national health insurance and so forth. That is, the British elite built more legitimacy than did the French, the German, the Russians, or the Chinese. And there are lessons for that which cultural policy is now being explored to try to pursue. That is, the Chinese leadership, it's no secret, the people who are the highest in education, the smart intellectuals, the computer programmers, the people with PhDs in China are highly individualistic. They could work very successfully in India, Britain, US, Canada, Australia, and many have done so. Look at you here. You're not in China right now. You come to the West to get a master's degree, and you're paid for, many of you are paid for by your government. I don't know if you were, or your family who was feeling similar kinds of concerns. That is, how do you connect that instead of, and so the people who are the intellectual elite of the Chinese are potentially, and they say in national surveys that the Chinese do themselves, they trust the national government least. Whereas the less educated people in China trust the national government more. Okay, that's the opposite of what you find in Western Europe or the US. So if the Chinese national government has not, what that says, the Chinese national government has not been building legitimacy with its own elite in ways that the English have done for 2 or 3 or more centuries. And so that's why I've had many people who are visitors come here and say, I want to study cultural policy because we want to do it better in China. And it includes women's roles, retiring or not retiring at a certain age, moving from rural to urban areas, doing science and defining what is science, what is okay, etc. We're a little over time. Okay, I would love next time to be able to listen more and talk less, but I guess my concern is if you don't get some core ideas out there, if I don't tell you some of the core ideas, you're going to walk away and you'll never know who Fabrice was or what the Battle of Waterloo is, and now you do. Okay, think about connecting these things, and let yourself do a little. Okay, another thing that was invented end of the 19th century and early 20th century by James Joyce, by Faulkner in the US, by others, was called free association. And it linked, of course, with emotion, with Wagner's idea that what drives you from one concept or one mood or one feeling to the next, you're letting your own feelings drive you. Okay, let your own feelings drive you and pull these pieces together in the next week and tell us where we should go from there. How's that? And you can listen to a little more of the Wagner or read any of the others, and you see how this is a tragic underside in some respects of European history with the Holocaust. At the same time, it's got the sources of building Shakespeare and the popular culture through highly legitimate leaders from Queen Elizabeth to the Manor House in England in ways that the local dukes and counts in Italy and Germany failed at doing as well. So we can learn from history, and that is, I'm not trying to say we should just use, quote, history. I'm a social scientist. I'm looking, as are you, I'm trying to help you find and have articulated by Levi-Strauss or Gertz or others, some specific mechanisms for analyzing the Proud Boys or people retiring or feminism in China or German diplomats. See you next week. Yes, yeah.